Today, what we're going to do is obviously I'm going to let you go back and just get into your work, alright? But from what I've read so far, I just want to take a step back and I want to just make sure we're all on the same page and know how the assignment's going to flow. Because some of us, which is great, are putting heaps of information in, but what you're doing is you're sort of front loading all the information into one part when you can spread it out, and that means you won't have to repeat yourself throughout the assignment. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay, so that's the flow, but also this word assumption and how it applies in the context of 3.1. So we're all trying to bring assumptions in, but we're not quite on the money about what the assumption is for 3.1, which we'll talk about in a sec. So what I've done is I've put together this little flow diagram for you. So at the moment, we're trying to get excellence by critically examining our physical activity experiences, and then from that say, what have we learned, and then how's that going to then help me devise strategies to stay active throughout my lifestyle. Alright? So there's essentially two parts, which was put into task 1 and then task 2 down here. Task 1, which we're doing at the moment, is you're looking at you're critically examining your physical activity experiences to date. So we've divided it into primary school, secondary, intermediate school, secondary school. What you're actually doing is no more than just saying, okay, what were my influencing factors in terms of what activities I did at primary, intermediate, secondary school, and then also how that's impacted your well-being. Okay? Then you look at the positives of that, the negatives of that, and then what is that likely to mean for my future participation? Okay? Or what has it meant? Right? So for secondary and intermediate, primary and intermediate, it could have had a bit of impact on what you're doing at secondary. Right? But I don't want you to go too much past that. You can identify some assumptions in there, which some of you have done. I think it was Daniel and Chris identified something about similar to the exemplar around when they played football, they were labelled as sissies, and they started looking at assumption around that. But I don't want to go too much past identifying it. Don't explain it too much. So that's what you're doing for those three. Task 1B is where you go, okay, I've written all that out now and I've had a look. Now you start to identify the trends. So what we mean by trends is there a common thread in terms of, say, for example, an influence that's been the main influence? So, for example, it might be that you have done all your physical activity purely because it's been social. I think Eva identified in her one so far that really the only reason she got into physical activity was to be with her mates. And that's fine. So she starts examining that as a trend. What does that mean? Then we're doing some research behind that about what's happening not just within this school, and then trying to compare and contrast her experience with research. Then there's this word assumption as well. Okay, so in that part here, you also identify assumptions around your physical activity. So you might have played a, inverted commas, a female sport. Or you might have played, inverted commas, a manly sport in New Zealand such as rugby, and you start to examine that trend. Alright? Then you go into task 2, which we'll talk about later, which is essentially going, okay, so what? Out of that, what am I going to do now for the rest of my life to make sure I'm staying active? And how does these experiences shape what I'm going to do, my strategies? Is there any questions on that? Yes?
Assumptions for like 1A. Do we need to have like assumptions within each like period of our life, like the primary, intermediate?
No.
Or just like a couple?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Really, for excellence, if you had one assumption and one trend and you really researched it and critically examined it, that would be enough.
Okay.
So you might only identify one or two trends or assumptions through here, but don't speak too much about it, because once we've done that, after next Tuesday when these are all handed in, these 3 logs, we can start. I'll guide you in that process. Yep. Okay. Yep. Luke.
If you have physical activity that crosses over between primary and intermediate, do you try and like keep it brief on both sides so that you don't explain too much?
So give me an example.
So I'm doing like contact sports for intermediate and also ball and contact sports for primary, and update the league and primary and intermediate? So
Yes.
we'll do
Yeah, what I would like you to do is I'd like you to try and keep your physical activities different across the three logs, unless there's a change in the influence of why you play league, and it's stuff that you can really elaborate on. Okay? Alright? Any other questions? Okay. Stop that video.